Welcome to another episode of Setting the Tone, where we take a look at the main theme of a series and break down why and how it works so perfectly for what it was written for. And on today's episode, we're tackling one small portion of everyone's favorite battle franchise.
Who is the deadliest warrior?
Close enough. Roll the intro. Fate is a big franchise, and it's pretty much impossible to say that there's one single focus on the franchise as a whole anymore. The basic selling point between each series is the idea of summoned heroic spirits who come to the modern world via magic to battle against each other. Sometimes it's a bloodbath over the Holy Grail, sometimes it's just for a bite of tasty food, but because of the diversity from title to title, most of them can be experienced without necessarily needing the others. And this differentiation is exactly why the quality of art, animation, and most importantly music can range so drastically for each new iteration. Fate Apocrypha probably isn't anyone's favorite Fate adaptation, and if it is, it's probably because they haven't seen the better ones. I don't really know much about the original novels, but I can only assume that the anime felt so rushed because it had to condense the stories of about 30 different characters into 25 episodes. But where the story faltered, the music picked up the slack, which is why I found myself enjoying the anime despite how forgettable the show ended up being. Composed by Yokoyama Masaru and performed by the Budapest Symphonic Scoring Orchestra, this soundtrack is as big and dramatic as its premise. Two warring factions with 7 masters and summoned servants, each battling for the greater Holy Grail. Yokoyama himself is a huge name in the anime industry, having composed soundtracks for anime such as Queen's Blade, Freezing, Plastic Memories, Your Lie in April, Yamada-kun and the Seven Witches, Gundam Iron-Blooded Orphans, Occultic 9, Seven Deadly Sins, Scum's Wish, Love and Lies, The Fruits Basket Remake, Horimiya... A lot, basically. Not to mention his arranging work for Steins Gate or his works on live-action adaptations and opening, ending, and insert songs. This man has basically done it all and is arguably Kosaki Satoru's biggest rival, but we'll save that topic for another time. When I first watched Fate Apocrypha, the music completely blew me away, and I had no idea that the composer was the same person who had written for Your Lie in April at the time. Having now heard a multitude of his works, his level of diversity and ability to match the pacing of the series he's working on is nothing short of incredible, especially comparing his work on Apocrypha to something like this. Kajiura Yuki's music for Fate Zero might be more popular because of the distinct style of Kajiura's writing, but in absolutely no way is her music as diverse as Yokoyama's. And this is the sole reason that I find myself listening to Apocrypha's soundtrack from time to time, but almost never Zero's. The beginning of Apocrypha's theme begins with an intense low rumble from the double basses and cellos, initiated by a light timpani hit and some otherworldly strumming and plucking on the dulcimer's strings. A young boy soloist begins chanting, adding to the ominous nature of the otherworldly introduction we've opened with. Right away, this indicates that this story will be dark and, as implied with the timpani, that there will be battle and bloodshed, as orchestral drums often indicate a battlefield atmosphere. The basses circle and descend from F to C sharp, setting us up for the first section before landing on D to introduce a relatively quick ostinato on the dulcimer around A minor. We've felt the tension, and now these quick high runs tell us that whatever plans the warring factions have created are now in motion. It's subtle and light, but it's a change that starts to get your blood pumping. This also reinforces one of the two simultaneous keys that we are in, D minor and D Dorian, as A minor works as the fifth of D Dorian, while the diatonic pattern clashes with D minor's B flat. These two simultaneous keys represent not only the opposing factions battling it out with one another, but also the organizations they represent. Dorian is best recognized as the folk music mode, and this relation to European folk tunes ties it to the Igda Millennia clan of Romania representing the Black faction. The minor scale, being much more universal and less culturally specific, fits the Mages Association, the international organization representing the Red faction. The violins soon join in with the dulcimers ostinato, as if to show that both factions' plans are in motion, possibly testing the waters against each other without making any particularly large clashes. It doesn't take too long, however, for the violins and flutes to start creating a counter melody. Much like the battles in the show, things develop rather quickly, and the action begins with only the minimal amount of build-up necessary. This clash can also be heard in the rhythmic modulation that occurs as the counter-melody switches between compound and duple meter, meaning that the music's pulse switches between rhythmic groups of 3 and 2. A brief pause occurs at the climax of the build-up, like a calm before the storm or
the deep breaths before the plunge,
followed by an intense orchestral swell. Drums and electronics push the rhythmic dulcimer ostinato along as the brass section quickly builds underneath. Nothing quite represents the image of war like drums and war horns, and the strings and woodwinds are mostly used for ornamentations and musical accents. These patterns also introduce our third musical motif, the first two being the dulcimer patterns and our newest being the simple diatonic step from C to D. In most contexts, hearing these two notes played back-to-back isn't anything particularly noteworthy, but because of the repetition throughout this theme, it becomes a reminder of the anime's intensity. Even without the context of the show or story, this rising figure sounds much like a war horn being played as the cavalry comes riding into battle. It actually becomes so relevant to the looming battles ahead that even hearing two completely different notes played in the same rhythm for a different track altogether still lets you know that you're in the world of Fate Apocrypha. The A section then begins moving into a transitional section, with the low and high brass instruments interplaying to create a rising and falling melody that builds upon itself but always comes back to the C and D motif. As the strings build to support the horns, the whole ensemble crescendos its way into the B section, where a solo violin takes the dulcimer's ostinato and turns it into a full-blown melody. While the low horns play in counter melody, we also get introduced to a viola soloist, hinting at later developments where the violin and viola will play off of each other in turn. This is yet a further example that delves into how the Fate franchise works as a whole. These two soloists represent two individual warriors engaged in battle amongst the chaos of the battlefield around them. Depending on how you want to view this, these two soloists could represent two opposing servants duking it out, or it could also represent a servant and master working in tandem to fight against the enemy as a whole. Both interpretations make sense, as there are various situations where either might take place throughout the anime, and thus the nature of conveying the interplay of these two strings is brilliant writing for a general overture. Coming out of the battling string soloists, the orchestra adopts the battling motifs idea on a broader scale, overlaying the transitional rising and falling melody from before atop the dulcimer's ostinato. These clashing melodies and rhythms that are slightly out of time with one another create an almost grating sound as they build and build in intensity. Right as they reach the peak of their ascent, however, there's a very sudden pause before one final explosion sounds to close out the track. What you might be surprised to discover after hearing this theme in its entirety is that, all in all, there isn't actually that much musical material. Don't get me wrong, there are tons of individual musical ideas at play, but as far as actual content, it's really just a series of these ideas building on top of each other, playing in different combinations until the end. What's so genius about this is that it not only allows the track to serve as an overture and main theme, but that it captures the often confusing nature of different characters and battles weaving in and out of focus without becoming a confusing piece of music in and of itself. Many of the things we can hear during the various parts of the music are actually always there in some form or other, and merely get emphasized while other parts occur in the background, perhaps in the counter melody or ostinato. This is probably also the best way of showcasing that less is more, at least on a broad scale, and what I mean by that is that while there are only a handful of general ideas, dueling strings, melody and counter melody, ostinato and build-up, etc., since these general ideas are actually made up of many individual ideas, nearly every track in the soundtrack is able to reference at least one of these at any given moment, immediately creating an association between the scene in front of us and the greater Grail War occurring as a whole. With that in mind, I don't have the time to point out every single reference each track has to the main theme, so we'll just go through a handful of notable examples and see what each one has to offer. As expected of a battle track, this one skips over any sort of build-up and jumps straight into a drum-heavy rendition of what was originally the violin solo, slightly altered and played on the whole violin section this time. This pattern is cut off by the basses playing a quick rising rhythm, while the brass section comes in with a descending line we didn't hear in the original theme. These rising and descending lines converge and weave about one another, dancing around each other before shifting into a new pattern. The powerful driving rhythms and piercing nature of the brass and pitched percussion playing what was once the transitional dulcimer pattern adds a level of explosiveness and intensity not present in the original. Where the main theme was focused on building up to the large explosion and showcasing the nature of the battles in relation to the plot, the battle version keeps a constant level of action going, allowing it to be placed in any battle scene without the concern that it might drop in intensity. It goes without saying that this is a huge reduction to a much calmer piano solo version. Despite the title of this one being Hope, there is a heavy sense of melancholy, possibly even sadness, as the familiar melodies play above the languid supporting rhythms and simpler harmonies. This can be attributed to the servants taking part in the battle, as their reasons for answering the summoner's calls always boil down to an unresolved regret from their past. Where the Greater Grail and its wish-granting ability are a way of overcoming this regret, it also means that they must acknowledge it further, proving that their scars run the deepest amongst their enemies. And for those watching that understand how the Grail works thanks to Fate Zero, it adds another layer to the tragedy that can befall those who seek its power. While this isn't one of the direct derivatives of the main theme, it showcases one of the most prominent motifs while also highlighting a couple of characters at the same time. This piece is tied to the character Sieg, though more specifically to Siegfried, whose power is inherited by Sieg after the Saber Servant gives his life to save the homunculus boy. Siegfried's unyielding heroism and Sieg's desire to liberate the homunculi slaves is captured in the slow rising harmonies, rising out of the hardships and atrocities around them. The melody moves slowly as a result, supported by the gradually rising bass line that occasionally takes a step back down to represent the weight of both men's burdens. There's a certain gravitas to the slow tempo that the faster versions simply don't possess. Even at the closing section, where the orchestra swells for an explosion, this slow tempo results in us feeling the weight of each note pushing towards the end. It might not get your heart pumping wildly, but because of the association with the adrenaline-inducing previous versions, this almost seems to freeze you in place, face, as if watching an intense action scene in slow motion right as the final blow is about to land. For both men to sacrifice everything they have for the ideals they refuse to falter from, this slow, rising, triumphant rendition is nothing short of perfect as a representation of their unyielding wills in the face of adversity. Again, this is only a handful of iterations, and while I certainly enjoy a lot of the other versions, there is little to say about them that wouldn't be rendered redundant. Given that the primary focus of the anime itself is on the battles, leaving us with little time to appreciate most of the characters, the music unfortunately cannot represent more than what you would expect in this case. Each battle iteration does its job of getting you hyped up with intense building drum patterns and horn blasts, and each contemplative version reduces the music based on the type of context, sometimes by simplifying the rhythms, other times taking away the melody entirely, leaving us with only harmonic environments and atmospheres. Fate Apocrypha is far from a perfect anime, and as much as I love the concept of this many characters getting involved in a holy grail war, it just couldn't pull off the level of storytelling it needed to in only 25 episodes. But even if the show failed in that regard, the music managed to meet and even exceed what we could have expected from a premise this chaotic. The main theme manages to capture the dark undertones hiding beneath the show's crazy action sequences and makes itself relevant enough to get referenced in nearly every other track. Your Lie in April might have made me aware of Yokoyama Masaru, but Fate Apocrypha was undoubtedly the reason that I started to remember his name. And for that reason alone, I'll always think back on this show fondly, even if I can hardly remember what happened in half of the show. But that's just my opinion, and I've never actually talked about this show in person with anyone, so let me know down in the comments what you guys thought of Fate Apocrypha, and make sure to hit that like and subscribe button while you're at it. And if you enjoyed this episode of Setting the Tone, you can vote on what I'll be covering in the next episode over on my Patreon for the low price of $3 Canadian. That's right, nothing more than a loony and a toonie. Thanks as always for watching, and I will see you in the next one.